Okay, thank you, everybody. I understand you've got a list of the players that are here and are working in the office with us this week, so I won't go into that. Let me give you a little bit of additional information, both substantive and on process. As I think you know, yesterday we received a revised proposal on certain issues from the NHL. It was on some of the core economic issues. And we had a meeting yesterday to briefly to discuss it. After that, we did some work on it overnight and a little bit this morning. There was another meeting, a 2-on-2, in which we discussed it further and asked a series of questions and got some clarifications on it. From our side, what we intend to do and are in the process of doing is working on a proposal in response to this one, which, if luck holds, we will have for the NHL tomorrow. If it doesn't hold, it may be as late as Friday, but at this point I'm pretty optimistic that it will be tomorrow. For those of you that don't know, when we go through a process like this on a major proposal, obviously there's a bunch of staff work involved, and then there is, in coordination with the players, that staff work is done, and then we ordinarily will contact our executive board and/or negotiating committee to make sure that they're in agreement and sync with how we go forward, and then depending on how that discussion goes, if there's a need to modify the approach that has been suggested, that's what they do. In very brief summary, in terms of the proposal the NHL made, it goes essentially like this. Their original proposal on economics, using current definitions, the definitions in the current agreement, reduced the player's share of HRR from 57% to 43%. Okay, their initial suggestion that it was 46% incorporates some changes in the definitions which make the total HRR pot smaller. And we've preferred to discuss it in the context of the definitions that everyone understands. So the proposal was to reduce, as you know, from 57 to 43. The proposal that we got yesterday, again, using current definitions, would increase that 43 to 46. When it is fully phased in, what that would do would be to reduce the player's share by approximately, and not very approximate, you'll see because there's a decimal point in it, 19.3%. And if you had a fully phased in proposal and we had the same revenue as we had last year, HRR as we had last year, that's $361 million. Now obviously you cannot accomplish that kind of a reduction without some modification in what players are paid. And they told us, we assumed, and then got clarification again today, that that would in the early years, and remember there is a phase-in, but in their proposal, but in the early years that would be accomplished, and to the extent necessary, by very significantly increasing the amount of escrow that would be involved. From a player standpoint, you should understand it doesn't make much difference. If a player doesn't get the dollar value on his contract because there's a rollback in the contract, which is simply a name for crossing out one number and writing in another number, or whether he doesn't get an amount because there's escrow, he still doesn't get it. It amounts to the same thing. And that's obviously one of the issues which has occurred in the other cap sports and which is going to have to be in some fashion addressed as we go forward here. In addition to that, we asked about current financial numbers, because when we are discussing, as the union likes to put it, where are the problems we need to fix and what are the magnitude of those problems, we tend to look at them club by club rather than overall aggregating the league. Because when you aggregate the league, that to a certain extent disguises the fact that you have some very profitable teams and some that aren't. And we wanted to get the most current financial numbers that the league has. We don't have them from last year yet. I understand that there is a bunch of information on its way over to us today, and hopefully that will come in, so we'll be able to incorporate what the magnitude of the problem, if any, which is showed by those numbers, is as we contemplate the proposal that would be made. In addition to that, obviously, what we're going to want to do, and if we can get help from the NHL in this regard, that'd be great, is look at the effect of the owner's proposal, combining the salary issues and the revenue sharing issues on the individual team numbers. Okay, and we don't have any information on that yet. Hopefully it'll be forthcoming promptly. So that's the process that we have been engaged in, and it'll continue on an ongoing basis. As you can see, there are quite a number of players here. When we finish the event we are now conducting, whatever we're calling it, we're going to go back to the office and go back to work.
Yesterday, Gary characterized their new proposal as a meaningful or significant step. Now that you've done, the analysis, do you feel like that's an accurate representation of what this latest proposal?
I'm not going to characterize it. I will leave that to you. I can give you the numbers on it. As I said before, the current agreement provides for a 57% player share of HRR, which is about 51% of overall HRR. The HRR that we look at, of all revenue, the HRR we have is already significantly less than the whole. That would reduce it to 43, and this brings it back to 46. And there were phase-ins involved, and so obviously there is some movement there. I'm not going to suggest that there isn't. I'll leave it to you to characterize it, and perhaps you could flip it the other way. If the players had said we wanted to increase the player's share by the same amount, which is 14 points of HRR, that they reduced it, which would have taken it to 71%, and then reduced that to 68, would that be, how would you characterize that? I don't know. You'll have to make that judgment. Having said that, there was some movement there, and what we're going to endeavor to do is come up with a response which you would like to believe would allow us to make a deal, and if it doesn't quite do that, would push the process along.
How difficult is it for
Wait,
you?
there was a question over here that I interrupted somebody.
Sorry, you mentioned the length of this proposal in terms of, is it 5 years, 6 years?
The original NHL proposal, my memory is, was 5 years. The current proposal is 6. Our proposal was for 3 years and an option year. And while we haven't come to a conclusion as to whether we would modify the term, the proposed term in our responsive proposal, we think shorter is better. We think shorter is better for 2 reasons. One, it's hard to predict the future. And secondly, when we're in an era in which we say there are problems we are trying to fix, and one of the ways we're going to fix it is by limiting the rate of increase in player salaries as revenues increase, then you may need to look at that a little more quickly than you might otherwise. But we haven't decided whether to modify that part of our proposal yet.
How difficult is it for you to counter-propose without the information that you still think you need?
Well, obviously it makes it more difficult, but we do have a lot of information and we'll do the best we can. And if we reach the conclusion that we can only go so far and no further, we'll tell them that. But, they've indicated that they'll be sending a bunch of this information over. I think some of it may already be there today, and hopefully that'll be helpful.
The HRR definition, there was a definition last year. There's a new definition now in the NHL proposal. What's out HRR to have that new definition?
Well, it's a bit complicated, but essentially what I can tell you is that certain limitations on costs that they would net would be taken out. There would be a deduction for certain capital expenditures at arenas, and certain costs which go to players who are not playing in the NHL would be included. There's more to it than that, and it unfortunately doesn't lend itself to a discussion at a meeting like this, but that's the gist of it.
Did the league's proposal also keep in some of the contract restrictions that they'd introduced in July? Like 5-year deals?
It has, the short answer is those proposals have not been withdrawn, but we haven't been focusing on the player contracting proposals. We've been focusing on the numbers.
A lot of our, I think the media side, a lot of the attention has been on revenue sharing and percentages, and 57 as opposed to 43. But crux now HR, that becomes, I guess,
No. I think that when you ask that question, you're trying to parse it too finely. When you try to come up with an agreement, obviously you're concerned with what the dollar numbers are. You're concerned with how they move. On the player side, and to a certain extent on the club side, you're concerned with how they are divided among the players and what the club obligations are. In professional team sports, you're concerned with revenue sharing. In an industry like this, you're concerned with revenue sharing as we see it, that ought to be directed to the teams that need it in a fashion which is more likely than we've seen before to cause them to work their way through the problems. Then you have all the player contracting issues, and then you have the other things. So it's sort of possible after the fact, in my experience, to say when they got an agreement on this, that's what did it. It's harder before the fact. And where you have a lot of moving pieces, you know, potentially in the sense that there are a lot of things which can change, which is not to suggest they will change. You don't want to make that judgment, certainly at this stage of the process. I wouldn't want to do that.
Yesterday, Gary Bettman said that you're close to a deal on the revenue sharing between ownership. Is that a fact?
Oh, I don't know what Gary means by close. You'll have to ask him. They have proposed an increase. We proposed a much bigger increase. So to the extent we both proposed increases, we agree on that. Having said that, our proposed structure and the sources and uses of the revenue sharing funds are quite different than what they have proposed. And when I said before that the structure really matters, that's part of what I was going with. In addition, from our side, obviously, we want to know what revenue sharing payments the teams that are on the high end of the revenue scale are going to be willing to make that aren't paid for by reductions in player salaries. And we don't have that number yet. Hopefully we will soon.
Do you believe that this latest proposal is the basis of common ground for the start of what most people would call negotiations?
Well, first of all, we're in negotiations. What you're describing is the intensity level of them. And all I can say is what I've said before. I'm out of the prediction business. You know, after the fact, I'll be glad to share with you what I think the crucial points were, and that what you do is you go at it day by day until you find a way to make the deal, find a way to make the agreement. And if you don't find it yesterday, you try today, and if you don't find it today, you try tomorrow, and you keep at it. I know that sounds trite, perhaps, and it sounds a little boring, but that's the process.
Could that process though go to the 15th at this, the way things are going?
Could it? Conceivably, of course it could. Hopefully it won't, and hopefully if we're making progress, the 15th won't turn out to be an abracadabra date.
Why do you think the owners are trying to change the definition of HRR?
I'm not sure. I think that there are some of them that believe that before we try and determine how to divide up the pie, there's certain things we should take out of the pie first. Players don't, but you should understand that you could say, one could say, all right, we want to reduce HRR by X%, but what that means is we have to up the player's share to compensate for the reduction in the overall size. You could do that. It doesn't accomplish very much. That's why our preference has been to leave the definitions the same, because everybody understands what they mean, and everybody understands what the effect is. And so we think it's much easier that way.
But I mean,
I'm not going to speculate on what the motives are beyond that. You know, Gary or Bill may be able to help you on that. Okay? Sounds good. Thank you.